What you're about to hear happened just a year ago in one of Chicago's most prestigious buildings. The names have been changed to protect the families involved, but the terror they experienced was all too real. Michael Chen had lived in apartment 13A at the Millennium Tower for 3 years. As a cybersecurity specialist, he valued privacy and silence above all else. The building was perfect for him. Modern, secure, and most importantly, quiet. For 3 years, apartment 13B next door had remained empty. Michael had grown accustomed to the silence. No footsteps above his head. No muffled conversations through the walls. No children running in the hallways. Just perfect, peaceful silence. He had asked the building manager once why 13B stayed vacant for so long. The manager, a nervous man named Robert, had simply shrugged and said, "Some apartments are harder to rent than others." When Michael pressed for details, Robert quickly changed the subject. But Michael didn't care about the reasons. He was grateful for the quiet. His work required intense concentration, and the empty apartment next door was a blessing. He had even started using the shared wall as a soundproofing test for his home office equipment. That was before March 15th, 2024, before everything changed. Michael first noticed the moving trucks on a Tuesday morning. He watched from his window as furniture was carried into the building. Normal furniture, a couch, a small dining table, boxes labeled David's room in a child's handwriting. He felt a pang of annoyance. His perfect silence was about to be broken. That evening, he heard them for the first time. A woman's voice, cheerful and excited, saying something about our new home. A child's laughter echoing through the walls. Normal sounds. Happy sounds. Michael had almost felt guilty for being annoyed. The woman, Liza, he learned from the mailbox, seemed like a good mother. The boy, David, was quiet and well-behaved. For the first week, they were model neighbors. But on March 22nd, exactly 1 week after they moved in, something changed. Michael woke up at 3:33 a.m. to a sound he had never heard before in his 3 years of living in 13A. A child's voice, but not quite right, not quite natural. At first, he thought David was sick. Maybe he was having a nightmare or talking in his sleep. But the voice continued for nearly an hour, speaking in what sounded like a foreign language. Michael lay in bed, listening through the wall. The voice was rhythmic, almost chanting. And underneath it, he could hear something else. A woman's voice, so quiet, he almost missed it, repeating the same strange words. When morning came, Michael convinced himself he had imagined it. Stress from work, perhaps. A dream that had seemed too real. But the next night, it happened again. Same time, same voice, same impossible language. This time, Michael got up and pressed his ear to the wall. The voice was definitely coming from David's room. But it didn't sound like any 8-year-old he had ever heard. It was deeper, older, filled with an authority that made Michael's skin crawl. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Michael was a man of logic and facts. If something was happening next door, there had to be a rational explanation. So he did what he did best. He investigated. He started with the building's history. The Millennium Tower had been built in 1998, constructed on the site of the old St. Mary's Children's Hospital. The hospital had operated from 1952 to 1994. when it was destroyed in a fire. That was when Michael found the first disturbing detail. The fire had started on the 13th floor in the pediatric ward. 12 children had died, but not from the fire itself. The official report listed their cause of death as unexplained cardiac arrest. Michael dug deeper. In the weeks leading up to the fire, hospital staff had reported unusual behavior from several children on the 13th floor. They spoke in languages they had never learned, displayed knowledge of things they couldn't possibly know, and showed signs of supernatural strength. The hospital had brought in religious advisors. The final report, buried deep in the city archives, mentioned spiritual intervention and unsuccessful cleansing rituals. But here was the detail that made Michael's blood run cold. The exact location of the pediatric ward's main room was now occupied by apartment 13B. Armed with this knowledge, Michael began to pay closer attention to his neighbors. During the day, Liza and David seemed completely normal. Liza worked from home as a graphic designer. David attended school and played quietly in the afternoons. But every night at 3:33 a.m., the chanting began. Michael installed sound recording equipment along the shared wall. What he captured made him question everything he thought he knew about reality. The voice speaking wasn't just David's. It was multiple voices, overlapping and harmonizing in ways that should have been impossible. And underneath it all, he could hear Liza, her voice growing stronger each night, joining the impossible chorus. But the most disturbing part was what happened in the background of the recordings. Sounds that shouldn't exist. Footsteps of people who weren't there. Children's laughter that seemed to come from empty rooms. And underneath it all, a sound like scratching, as if something was clawing at the walls from the inside. After 2 weeks of recordings, Michael knew he had to act. He knocked on Lisa's door during the day when David was at school. Liza answered, looking exhausted. The cheerful woman who had moved in just weeks ago now looked hollow, her eyes sunken and dark. "I know this sounds crazy," Michael began, "but I think there's something wrong with your apartment." Lisa's reaction was immediate and terrifying. Her face went completely white, and she grabbed Michael's arm with a grip that was impossibly strong. "You hear them too?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Hear who?" "The children, the ones who call to David every night, the ones who want him to join them." Michael felt his world shift. "Liza, what are you talking about?" She pulled him into the apartment. And immediately Michael felt the temperature drop. The air was thick and oppressive, filled with a smell he couldn't identify, but that made his stomach turn. "It started the first night," Liza said, her voice shaking. "David said he heard children playing in his room. I thought it was just the adjustment to the new place. But then I started hearing them too." She led him to David's room, and Michael saw something that made his legs nearly give out. Every surface was covered in symbols, carved deep into the walls, the furniture, even the ceiling. They weren't painted or drawn. They were burned into the materials, as if branded by something impossibly hot. "I don't remember carving these," Liza whispered. "But every morning there are more." That night, Michael convinced Liza to let him set up cameras in David's room. They needed to document what was happening. At 3:33 a.m., the cameras captured something that would haunt Michael for the rest of his life. David sat up in bed, but his eyes remained closed. He began to speak in that ancient language, but now the camera revealed the truth. He wasn't alone. 12 translucent figures stood around his bed. Children, ranging in age from 5 to 12. all wearing hospital gowns that flickered between solid and transparent. They were the ones speaking through David, using his voice to communicate with the world of the living. But that wasn't the most horrifying part. The most horrifying part was Liza, standing in the doorway, her eyes rolled back in her head, speaking in perfect unison with the dead children. And as she spoke, new symbols appeared on the walls, burning themselves into existence as if carved by invisible hands. The symbols weren't random. They were coordinates. Locations throughout the building where the children had died. And they were spreading, appearing in every room of the apartment, marking territory that now belonged to the dead. Over the following days, the supernatural activity began to spread beyond apartment 13B. Other residents reported elevator malfunctions, always stopping at the 13th floor. Cold spots appeared in the hallways. Children throughout the building began having nightmares about the friends on the 13th floor. Michael realized the truth. The 12 children who had died in the hospital fire weren't just haunting apartment 13B. They were using it as a base, a doorway between the world of the living and the dead. And they were recruiting. David wasn't just being possessed, he was being converted, slowly transformed into one of them. And Liza, in her desperate attempts to save her son, was being pulled into their world as well. Michael watched through his cameras as the transformation accelerated. David's appearance began to change. His skin became pale and translucent. His eyes, when they opened, were completely black. And his voice, even during the day, carried the echo of the 12 dead children. Liza was changing too. She stopped eating, stopped sleeping, stopped responding to the outside world. She spent her days staring at the symbols on the walls, tracing them with her fingers until they bled. On April 13th, exactly 1 month after Liza and David had moved in, Michael was woken not by the usual chanting, but by screaming. Blood-curdling screams that seemed to come from every direction at once. Michael grabbed his phone and called 911 as he ran to his door. In the hallway, he could hear Lisa's voice, but it wasn't speaking words anymore. It was making sounds that no human throat should be able to produce. Guttural, animalistic sounds mixed with what sounded like sobbing. When the police arrived, they found Liza in the hallway outside apartment 13B, clawing at the walls with her bare hands. Her fingernails were torn and bleeding, and she had scratched symbols into the drywall so deep that her fingers were worn to the bone. She was speaking in that ancient language, but now she was screaming it. Her voice hoarse and broken. Her eyes were completely black, and when the officers tried to approach her, she displayed impossible strength, throwing grown men across the hallway like they were children. It took 6 officers to restrain her. Even then, she continued to speak in that unknown language, her voice getting deeper and more inhuman with each word. But David was nowhere to be found. The police searched apartment 13B for hours, but David was not there. His bed was still warm. His clothes were still in his dresser. His school backpack sat by the door. But the boy himself had vanished. What they did find made the seasoned officers sick to their stomachs. Every surface in the apartment was covered in symbols, carved deep into the walls, floors, and ceiling. The symbols were still warm to the touch, as if they had just been burned into the materials. In David's room, they found something that made even the hardest detectives step back in horror. The symbols weren't just carved into the walls. They were carved into the furniture, the bedding, even the toys. And in the center of the room, burned into the hardwood floor, was a perfect circle of symbols surrounding a dark stain that tested positive for human blood. But it wasn't David's blood. It was much older. DNA analysis would later reveal it belonged to multiple individuals, children who had died decades ago. Liza was taken to Chicago General Hospital's psychiatric ward, where she remains to this day. She hasn't spoken a coherent word in English since that night. She only speaks in that ancient language, and when she does, every electronic device in the room malfunctions. The police investigation into David's disappearance lasted 6 months. They interviewed every resident in the building, searched every room, examined every piece of security footage. But David Rodriguez had simply vanished without a trace. Michael provided the police with all of his recordings and video footage. The investigators who reviewed the material requested transfers to other departments. 3 of them took early retirement. 1 suffered a complete nervous breakdown and was hospitalized. The case was officially closed as a missing person investigation, but Michael knew the truth. He had seen what happened in those final recordings. At 3:33 a.m. on April 13th, his cameras captured David floating in his room, speaking in that ancient language. But this time, he wasn't alone. 12 translucent figures surrounded him, children in hospital gowns, their faces burned and twisted from the fire that had killed them 30 years ago. As David spoke, his body began to change. His skin became translucent, his eyes turned black, and his voice merged with the voices of the dead children. The camera recorded him slowly fading, becoming more transparent with each word until he was nothing more than a whisper of light. But he didn't disappear. He became one of them. Today, apartment 13B sits empty. The building management has tried to rent it 17 times in the past 6 months. Every potential tenant who spends more than an hour in the apartment leaves immediately, claiming they heard children's voices and felt overwhelming dread. Michael still lives next door, but he's not the same man. He's lost 40 pounds. His hair has gone completely gray, and he rarely leaves his apartment. He's become obsessed with monitoring the supernatural activity that continues to plague the building. Every night at 3:33 a.m., he hears them. 13 voices now, speaking in that ancient language. The 12 children who died in the hospital fire, and David, who has joined their eternal chorus. But the most terrifying part isn't the voices. It's what they're doing. Michael's cameras have captured them, moving through the building, visiting other apartments, standing at the foot of sleeping children's beds. They're not just haunting apartment 13B anymore. They're spreading throughout the entire building, and they're looking for more children to join them. Liza remains in the psychiatric ward, but the doctors say she's not mentally ill. She's been possessed by something that medical science can't explain. Exorcists have been called in, but they've been unsuccessful. Whatever has taken hold of her mind is too powerful to be cast out. She draws the same symbols over and over again, covering every surface in her room. And when she speaks in that ancient language, other patients throughout the hospital begin to repeat her words, as if the possession is spreading.